He was just sitting there, a black man on a park bench, quiet, composed, holding nothing but a worn leather notebook and a look that revealed nothing. No signs, no raised voice, no camera, no threat. And yet within minutes he was on the ground, wrists zip-tied, notebook kicked aside like trash, while the world walked past without asking why. What started as a routine patrol in a sleepy southern town would unravel into something no one expected, something that would shake a precinct to its core and leave the nation stunned. Because this man, the one they profiled, humiliated, and locked away without cause, wasn't who they thought he was. But by the time they found out the truth, it was already too late. If you're watching this, hit like to support stories that expose injustice, subscribe to follow the full journey, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And at what point did you realize this story was never about what it seemed? The late afternoon sun baked the faded pavement of Orchard Park, casting long, stretched shadows of dog walkers, joggers, and elderly couples onto the quiet paths. In the midst of this calm suburban rhythm sat a lone black man, dressed in gray slacks, a white button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and worn brown leather shoes that were clean but clearly years old. In his lap rested a notebook, leather-bound, thick, its edges slightly curled from use. His name was Canaan Holt, though no one there that day knew it. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable, and his attention fixed not on the world around him, but on the pages he turned with slow, deliberate movement. The silence around him wasn't defensive or suspicious, it was focused. Yet from a distance, inside a slow-moving cruiser, Deputy Royce Thonner viewed the stillness as provocation. Royce was a man not accustomed to reflection, but to reaction. And when he saw Canaan unmoving, not on his feet, not smiling, not nodding as he drove past, he felt disrespected in a way that was almost primal. With a flick of his wrist, Royce turned the cruiser around, tires screeching louder than they needed to on the asphalt. He came to a stop just feet from the bench, threw open the door, and stepped out in a slow, performative motion. The few passers-by barely glanced. One woman with a stroller turned her gaze elsewhere immediately. Another jogger pulled out a phone, but didn't raise it. Royce approached, hand on his belt, and asked Canaan what he was doing there. Canaan glanced up for a brief second, and then turned another page. Royce's temper began to rise, and his voice grew louder as he demanded the man stand and leave. Canaan finally looked up and responded with a calm tone, something like a quiet apology, something like a no. Royce, now red in the face, interpreted it as a challenge. Without a moment's hesitation, he grabbed Canaan by the wrist, yanking him to his feet. The notebook fell to the ground. The pages fluttered open, revealing what looked like lists, diagrams, symbols no one there could make sense of. Royce glanced down, sneered, and kicked the book into the grass. Canaan didn't resist. He simply asked why. That single word was enough for Royce to shout for backup. Within 5 minutes, another cruiser pulled up. Officer Alden stepped out, took one look at the situation, and stood back, not interfering. Royce, now with audience, ordered Canaan to turn around, then pushed him against the side of the patrol car and zip-tied his wrists before pulling him backward and forcing him into the back seat. Canaan didn't protest. He kept his head down, breathing steadily, as Royce muttered something about cocky street preachers with nothing better to do. The few people who watched the scene unfold did so in silence. A teenage boy on a bicycle rode by, slowed for a moment, and then kept going. One elderly couple shook their heads, but didn't say a word. The notebook lay forgotten on the grass. A rookie officer named Beck, just arriving at the scene, picked it up. She glanced at the cover, then opened it, frowning as she flipped through unfamiliar handwriting, graphs, and codes. Royce saw her, snatched it from her hands, and told her it was gang nonsense. Beck started to say something, but stopped when she saw the look in his eyes. In the patrol car, Canaan stared at his reflection in the window. The sunlight hit his face just right, revealing a small scar near his temple. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. No one offered him water. No one asked his name again. Royce drove in silence for 10 minutes, muttering occasionally to himself about people thinking they could just sit around like kings and not be questioned. When they reached the precinct, he yanked the door open and told Canaan to get out. When Kanan stepped forward too slowly for Royce's liking, he was dragged out, his shoe catching on the door frame. He stumbled and hit the ground. Royce laughed and said something crude about broken statues. Kanan, still not resisting, simply picked himself up as best he could with his hands behind his back. Inside the building, no one questioned why a man had been brought in without charge. Officer Alden logged the intake as a disturbance of peace. The box for resisting verbal command was checked automatically. The intake camera flickered as the photo was snapped. Kanan didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just stared ahead, silent. Downstairs, Royce threw the notebook onto a desk and scribbled the label D, Johnstone, on the evidence tag. He told the clerk not to file it until tomorrow. When asked why, he said because this one's going to need extra sorting. In the holding room, Kanan sat on a metal bench, hands still tied, staring at a spot on the floor. The air conditioner above him rattled on and off, and each time it restarted, dust fell from the vent above his head. The room smelled like bleach and sweat. The camera above the door blinked green, then yellow, then went dark. Outside the room, Officer Royce Thonner stood at the monitor watching the feed, arms folded, still riding the adrenaline high of bringing in what he was already calling a suspicious, non-compliant suspect. He told the duty sergeant that the man had made aggressive gestures in the park and that he feared for his safety. It wasn't true, but it would be enough. Officer Orla Mills, Royce's longtime partner, walked past the room, gave Kanan a long stare through the observation window, and said he probably had a rap sheet longer than her leg. She chuckled, pulled out a piece of gum, and said guys like him always had something to hide. Royce tossed Kanan's wallet onto the desk beside the precinct's shared terminal. Inside was a single transit card, a library receipt, a clipped article on government ethics, and a black and white photo of a little girl with the words "Love You" always scribbled on the back. Mills flipped it over and scoffed. Royce pocketed the transit card and told Beck to enter the contents into evidence. Beck hesitated but complied. No one looked up the name. No one called dispatch to verify identity. They ran the man's fingerprints through the local system and came back with 0 matches. No warrants. No aliases. No hits. Royce looked at the screen and said he must have given a fake name. Mills leaned in and said he was probably undocumented and smart enough to stay off-grid. Royce agreed and added that the quiet ones always turned out to be the worst. The captain walked through the hallway at one point, glanced at the interrogation room's red light, and kept walking without a word. Back inside, Kanan remained still. The cuffs dug into his wrists, and the AC vent directly above him blew air, so cold that his fingertips were numb. He blinked slowly, the only motion betraying his growing fatigue. He was not offered food, not offered water, and not once asked if he needed medical attention. Hours passed like that. When Officer Mills re-entered, she brought with her a lukewarm coffee in a cracked ceramic mug, but offered only to Royce, who sat across from Kanan for exactly 10 minutes, asking nothing, saying nothing, just watching. When the silence became uncomfortable, Royce leaned back and said he had the look of a man used to silence, the kind who thought it gave him power. He smirked, pushed back his chair, and left. Kanan shifted slightly in his seat, but said nothing. His shoulders were beginning to ache, but he didn't flinch. Outside the room, Beck tried once more to speak to the clerk about running the fingerprint scan through the federal system, but Mills overheard and shut it down, saying they didn't waste federal resources on ghosts. Royce started filling out a disturbance complaint, falsifying a report that said Kanan had been shouting racial slurs at families in the park. He wrote that the suspect had evaded verbal commands and appeared under the influence. He added that a scuffle occurred during detainment, despite the man not having moved aggressively once. He signed it and slid it into the intake pile. Across the room, the damaged leather notebook that had been kicked into the grass earlier now sat half open on an empty desk. Its pages, though damp, were still legible. Beck, seeing it unattended, walked over and leafed through the first few pages. She saw diagrams, lists of municipal addresses, acronyms she didn't recognize, and what looked like meeting notes written in block letters with dates, times, and initials. Royce appeared suddenly behind her, snatched the notebook shut, and said if she was that curious, She could spend her time doing actual work. He tossed the notebook into a drawer, untagged and unlogged. The drawer was never locked. Later that evening, Officer Mills joked loudly in the break room that Royce had probably arrested an angel, the way the guy didn't talk. Another officer joined in, saying maybe they had detained some cult leader. They laughed. Royce said maybe he was a ghost. Maybe he wasn't even real. Mills said maybe that made it easier to forget about him. No one thought about the fact that the man was still in that chair, still cuffed, still unspeaking. The precinct grew quieter as night fell. Shift change came and went, and no one claimed responsibility for the detainee. A janitor entered the hallway, saw the red light above the room, and knocked on the observation window. Kanan looked up briefly. The janitor paused but kept moving. Back at the desk, the evidence locker was updated for the night, but Kanan's items weren't listed. The photo of the little girl remained folded in the trash bin beneath the intake counter. The transit card was never scanned. The fingerprint result from the local system was left hanging on the screen. No one bothered checking the national database. Upstairs, Royce played a round of darts with Mills while talking about college football. They didn't speak of the man. They didn't remember his name. Beck, unable to sleep, returned to the terminal and tried to resubmit the fingerprint scan through the interstate system. Royce Thonner returned, this time with another officer in tow, Senior Patrolman Wesley Furlow, a longtime enforcer known for his bulldog style and proud of his reputation for breaking down suspects. Furlow entered the room slowly, his gaze sweeping over Kanan like a predator examining a threat that didn't move. Royce closed the door behind him, leaned against the wall, and crossed his arms with a smirk that screamed satisfaction. Furlow placed a manila folder on the table with exaggerated force, sat down across from Kanan, and opened it theatrically. Inside were photos printed from street cameras, none showing Kanan clearly, all of them blurry at best. He pointed to one that featured a black male walking past a suburban cul-de-sac 3 days earlier and said that matched the suspect. He claimed Kanan had been seen pacing neighborhoods, looking through windows, possibly preparing to burglarize a home. Kanan said nothing. His eyes didn't drop to the photos. His shoulders remained relaxed, unmoved. Royce said silence would be taken as admission. Still nothing. Furlow grew louder, began detailing what it would mean to have those charges stacked: trespassing, attempted break-in, resisting arrest, obstruction, and failure to identify. The words meant nothing to Kanan, or if they did, he gave no indication. Furlow asked if he could read. Royce said maybe not. Maybe he was the type to pretend he couldn't, so the court would go easy. Kanan didn't flinch. The fabricated incident report was placed in front of him, and a pen was set beside it. The zip ties had been cut only minutes earlier, but the deep red indentations on his wrists remained, blood having pooled at the joints from hours of restricted circulation. Royce told him to sign. Kanan didn't even glance down. Furlow slapped the table and demanded cooperation. Kanan slowly raised his eyes and locked them onto Furlow's face, not with defiance, not with fear, but with something calmer and infinitely harder to read. Furlow recoiled a half step and then stood, muttering that it wasn't worth the time. Royce stayed behind, waiting another full minute in silence before grabbing the pen, stabbing it down into the table, and storming out, leaving the unsigned report behind. In the squad room, Officer Mills had taken it upon herself to go through Kanan's personal belongings again, focusing this time on his phone. She cracked it open using a data port and scrolled through its contents. The phone had no contact list, no photos, no social media apps. Instead, it contained encrypted folders, strange acronyms listed as calendar events: OID SDP Phase 2 CTS Log 7, and an unreadable app that launched a blank screen with a blinking cursor. Mills called it suspicious as hell and said it had to be some kind of gang communication tool or possibly a burner used by a drug mule. She waved it over to Officer Cheryl Ingram, a quiet clerk from records who had a background in linguistics and was known to recognize patterns others missed. Ingram took one look at the acronyms and froze slightly, her brow furrowed. She whispered something under her breath about familiar formatting, but before she could say more, Royce appeared, snatched the phone from her hands and barked that it was evidence, not a classroom experiment. He walked off and tossed the phone in a box beneath his desk without tagging it. The screen stayed on, still blinking. At that moment, Kanan's watch, which had been set aside in his plastic evidence bag, began to emit a soft, barely audible beep. Mills heard it, looked over, dismissed it as a low battery alert, and said maybe the guy was using it as a timer to measure how long he could go without breaking. No one touched it. No one turned it off. In the server room upstairs, a silent ping bounced back from a federal database. The ping was marked as priority red, but the software it relied on had been disabled weeks ago during a precinct systems upgrade. The alert went unseen. No email was triggered. No call was made. The system recorded the anomaly and buried it. Royce went back to the booking terminal and began a second incident file, this time marking Kanan under the label transient with attitude. He listed him as uncooperative, possible mental disturbance, and included a behavioral flag for aggression, even though no act of aggression had occurred. He added a digital note suggesting that the man may have attempted to mislead officers by using silence as a manipulation tactic. He ended the file by recommending transfer to county within 24 hours. The fabricated charges were left unverified. The red ink used for serious threat classification remained unused. The notebook, still in its untagged drawer, sat partially open. Inside, one page featured a list of 3 letter codes and mapped locations next to incident summaries in neat block handwriting. The last line on the page read August 19th, Bixby Avenue, passive contact escalation test. No one read that line. The drawer was slammed shut again when Beck, passing by, asked what would happen to the suspect if no charges were filed. Royce told her not to worry about ghosts. Beck asked if anyone had called the DOJ to verify federal detainment policy. Mills laughed out loud and said if the guy was a Fed, he'd have spoken up by now. No one considered that silence was the test. Despite 3 formal shift changes, not a single officer offered him so much as a blanket or a cup of water. Officer Royce Thonner passed by with Mills around 7:30 in the evening, both of them chuckling about the drunk driver brought in earlier that afternoon. A man named Tyler Keene, white mid-40s, pulled over swerving through a residential street with a bottle of whiskey tucked beneath the passenger seat. Tyler had slurred his words and nearly vomited during booking, but still managed to joke with Officer Alden and share stories about his years working in real estate. Alden laughed, patted him on the back, and told him to sober up before getting behind the wheel again. They gave him a blanket, a paper coffee cup with cream and sugar, and an Advil for his headache. He was released within 2 hours with a warning and a printed apology that the precinct had temporarily lost access to his DMV profile. Tyler left smiling, thanked everyone, and even shook hands with one of the lieutenants on his way out. Meanwhile, Kanan remained unseen and untouched, his identity still unverified, his belongings still improperly logged, and his physical needs completely ignored. Royce commented that it was better this way, that some people learned faster in the cold. Mills added that jail was supposed to be uncomfortable, not cozy, and called it tough love. As they passed by the observation window, they made quiet remarks about how still Kanan remained, likening him to a wax figure in a museum. Officer Alden snorted and suggested they nickname him Silent Sam. Beck, working quietly at the back of the room, heard this and frowned but said nothing. She had already tried raising concerns and had been shut down more than once. At 8:10, Officer Sean Kersey, known for his tendency to overshare online, snapped a blurry photo from the squad car cam archives and posted it to his private group chat titled Precinct Heat. The image showed Kanan, slightly turned toward the window of the patrol car, his face lit up only by the city lights outside. No context was given, just a caption that read, "This dude really thinks he's Gandhi." Within minutes, the image received laughing reactions and crude replies, with one member joking that the guy looked like he was writing poetry to the sky. Another replied that he probably thought the silence made him a prophet. Kersey laughed and forwarded the photo to a few old Academy friends. One of them, a recent graduate named Sarah Keeley, currently working her first shift in records, saw the photo and froze. She recognized the man, not from social circles, not from the neighborhood, but from a training presentation during Federal Liaison Orientation where images of key figures under government protection had been blurred for privacy. Though not told who he was, Sarah had memorized the eyes, the jawline, the posture, because the instructor had said, if you ever see this man in custody and no one knows his name, you call that in immediately. She ran to the hallway and intercepted Royce near the vending machines, holding up her phone and saying she thought the man in the photo might be someone important. Royce scoffed, asked her how long she'd been wearing the uniform, and told her rookies didn't get to throw out theories like they were in Quantico. When she tried again, he raised his voice and said not to question the chain of command. He walked off, leaving her standing in the hallway with a growing knot in her chest. Back in holding, Kanan remained as before, but now, barely audible beneath the hum of the vent and the occasional creak of old pipes, he began to hum, not a song, not a melody, but a slow, steady pattern of low notes. The sound was rhythmic, controlled, repeating in sequences of 5, then 4, then 3. Officer Beck, passing by to log her end-of-shift notes, paused briefly outside the cell and noticed the humming. She stared through the small glass window for a moment, confused by how precise the pattern seemed, but was called away before she could investigate. Behind the scenes, far above the city, a surveillance node connected to a federal satellite tracking system triggered a silent sequence protocol, launched automatically when a specific audio pattern, coded through tonal intervals, matched a file labeled dormant operative location unknown. The ping passed through 3 layers of firewalls before reaching a secure operations center in DC inside a locked control room. An automated screen lit up with the status. Asset Echo Red. Preliminary wake trigger detected. Locational confirmation pending. No alert was sounded due to a fail-safe requiring manual override. The system would attempt again in 1 hour. Back at the precinct, unaware of the activation, the officers left in pairs to grab dinner, joke about the weekend, and complain about shift fatigue. Royce and Mills laughed about the fact that their detainee hadn't said a single word in nearly a full day. Mills suggested betting on how long he could keep it up. Royce replied that it didn't matter how long, that people like that always broke eventually. And when they did, it was never pretty. Outside the precinct, the same black SUV idled across the street, headlights off, the engine humming low. No one noticed that its plate number was not local. No one noticed that its driver never left the vehicle. Inside, Sarah Keeley sat at her desk, rereading the photo Kersey had sent. She opened the federal orientation file she had stored on her personal flash drive and compared the two side by side. Royce squinted, muttered something about bureaucrats wasting gas money, and walked past without another glance. Inside the precinct, things were quieter than usual for a weekday morning. Officer Mills was already on her second cup of coffee, standing near the booking desk reviewing paperwork from the overnight shift, a bored look spread across her face. When Royce asked about the detainee in holding, Mills looked up blankly and said she hadn't seen him all morning. Royce froze halfway into a sip and asked what she meant. Mills blinked slowly and repeated herself. The man wasn't in holding. Royce tossed his coffee into the trash and made a beeline for the cell. The door was open. The bench was empty. The vent was still humming. Royce's face shifted from irritation to disbelief to something dangerously close to fear. He radioed the control room to check the surveillance footage. The screen showed nothing from midnight to 5:13 a.m., a total blackout. Royce demanded to know when the glitch started. The IT tech on duty said there had been a reboot scheduled for 2 a.m., but it never initiated, and no logs were left behind. Royce barked at him, saying this wasn't amateur hour, and stormed down the hall toward records. That's when Officer Alden shouted from interrogation room B. Royce pivoted sharply and burst into the room to find Kanan Holt seated calmly at the table, wrists once again zip-tied, head upright, posture perfect, eyes unfazed. The air in the room felt colder than before. The chair legs were exactly aligned with the table. Nothing in the room had been disturbed. Kanan had returned, or maybe, in a way that no one could explain, he had never left. Mills arrived seconds later, looking pale. She checked the logbooks and found the last signed custody record listed Kanan still in holding. There were no notes, no escort records, no restroom breaks, no recorded movement. The holding camera had no footage. None of the hallway cameras picked up a single frame of him between 11:57 p.m. and 7:41 a.m. The only clue was a faint whirring noise on one audio channel, a high-pitched tone lasting 20 seconds before static replaced it. Royce called in the captain, who barely blinked, then waved it off and told them to reprocess him for transfer. Just as Royce began preparing the county jail paperwork, a phone on the wall behind the booking desk rang, an unlisted line with a red stripe across the receiver. Beck answered it. Her eyes widened as she was asked to confirm a biometric alert pinged at the precinct during off hours. The voice identified itself as being from Washington, D.C., but gave no agency. Beck asked for a callback number. The line went dead. She relayed the message to Royce, who rolled his eyes and said feds always liked playing shadow games. When she tried to explain further, he cut her off and said they had enough on their plate without responding to prank calls. He moved forward with the transfer order, opening the digital form and inputting the name he had assigned, D. Johnstone. A bright red warning popped up at the bottom of the screen. High security clearance required TO process this individual. Royce squinted at the message, then clicked override. A second warning followed. Are you authorized to transport asset code red? Royce muttered something about overcomplicated government tech and clicked yes. Officer Beck, standing nearby, asked if he was sure. He told her to sign the form or find another department. Hesitant, she signed. 30 minutes later, Kanan was led out of the building by 2 officers assigned to transport duty. He offered no resistance, no protest. His posture remained still. He walked with the same steady pace he'd maintained since the moment of arrest. His watch, still presumed dead, pulsed once with blue light. As the vehicle left the precinct driveway, the black cars still parked near the fence remained unmoved. The men inside never stepped out. No one attempted to stop the van. 10 minutes into the ride, the transport vehicle veered slightly off its designated GPS route. The onboard tracker flagged the change, but failed to transmit due to a sudden signal dead zone that covered a quarter-mile radius. Inside the van, Kanan sat in the rear cage compartment, zip-tied again, but this time with reinforced cuffs. The air smelled of vinyl and old sweat. The 2 officers up front talked casually about weekend plans and agreed not to log the short detour. They were planning to stop for breakfast before heading to county. As they slowed near an underpass to turn into a diner lot, Kanan leaned back slightly, shifted his weight, and pressed his left hip against the edge of the seat frame. From the outside, it looked like an unconscious motion, a man adjusting himself for comfort. From the inside, it was precise. Hidden beneath the molded seat was a pressure switch designed only to respond to a very specific signature force, applied in a specific angle, with calculated timing. It clicked. Softly, the vehicle continued moving. The officers never heard it. They parked, stepped out of the van, locked it, and walked into the diner. 5 minutes later, when they returned, the cage compartment was empty. The zip ties lay neatly on the bench. The steel door showed no sign of tampering. The rear camera, previously recording, now showed nothing but black. Back at the precinct, Royce received a call from dispatch that the transport had reached a security checkpoint, but the checkpoint was 10 miles in the opposite direction. He called the transport team. They didn't answer. He tried again. No response. At that same moment, Sarah Keeley, now off shift and back in her apartment, opened her personal laptop, connected the flash drive she had hidden in her boot, and attempted to run a comparison scan. Royce Thonner's face had twisted into something halfway between rage and disbelief after learning that the transport van had arrived at county with no passenger. No forced entry, no camera feed, no sound, just static, black tape, and the perfectly placed restraints lying untouched on the bench seat. Officers Alden and Kersey insisted the van had been locked and secured the entire time, but Royce didn't believe them. He walked out of the supervisor's office and slammed a local alert request onto Beck's desk, shouting for dispatch to send out a citywide notice of an escapee in black slacks and a white shirt. He referred to Kanan Holt as a high-risk flight suspect. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in the records room, her hands still trembling slightly from the memory of her laptop going black the night before. She hadn't told anyone about the flash drive, and she wasn't planning to. What she did instead was take the only item left unsealed in the evidence drawer, a leather notebook that had sat, soaked and ignored for over 24 hours without proper logging. She opened it with caution, flipping past a few pages until she reached a section marked with a small red in the top right corner. The page was covered in handwritten acronyms, coordinates, and something that looked like internal procedural code. In the middle of the page were 5 initials, OIDSD. She stared at it, unsure why it felt familiar, then opened the precinct terminal and typed it into a federal internal database under secure keyword search. Nothing showed up at first. Then, 3 results flashed briefly and vanished, followed by a warning. Unauthorized access detected. Her screen locked. At that exact moment, Royce walked in behind her. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He grabbed the notebook from her hands, looked at the page, scoffed, and said the scribbles meant nothing. When she tried to explain the flag, he cut her off, told her not to waste time playing spy, and walked out with the notebook. She sat frozen in her chair, stomach twisting. Meanwhile, across state lines in Washington, D.C., an alert had already pinged at the Department of Justice in the Oversight Integrity Division. Deputy Director Ellis Montran received a secure message on a tablet. Echo Agent ID 2174 unverified since 0300. Embedded operation compromised. Location last confirmed. South Georgia Precinct. Detainee removed from log chain. Immediate assessment requested. Ellis swiped the alert to expand it and saw the blurry photo from the patrol car, overlaid with an internal file watermark. OP Echo Clean. Ellis didn't hesitate. He issued an encrypted signal to the local DOJ satellite office with 4 words: elevate to red priority. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, a dusty old fax machine in the intake office buzzed to life and printed a single page labeled Urgent Classified, for eyes of Federal Liaison only. The name at the top, Agent Kanan Holt. Officer Mills picked it up, rolled her eyes, and handed it to Royce without reading it. Royce glanced at the header, mumbled something about prank faxes, and crumpled the page before tossing it in the bin. Down the hall, Beck watched through a doorway and saw Sarah's face pale as she recognized the name on the fax. She followed Royce out of the room, grabbed the paper from the bin after he left, flattened it, and read the entire page in silence. It contained a code identifier matching the sequence from Sarah's laptop the night before, along with a single directive. Do not detain. Do not interfere. Do not delay. Asset embedded under Directive 19B. She didn't understand every part of it, but the message was clear. Kanan Holt wasn't just a random man on a bench. Sarah folded the page and stuffed it into her vest pocket. 2 hours later, she received a blank email from an encrypted address. The subject line read simply, "Confirmation received." Inside the email was one sentence: "Your station detained a DOJ observer. This is now a classified internal emergency." She read it twice, her hands sweating. She looked around. Nobody else seemed to know. Royce, still treating the matter as a routine embarrassment, decided to address the media at noon. He stood in front of the precinct with a row of officers behind him and cameras from 3 local stations pointed at his face. He gave a short statement blaming the escape on a combination of urban criminal tactics, shifting policy on detainment, and technical errors during transfer. He didn't mention the blackout. He didn't mention the biometric alert. He certainly didn't mention the notebook. He ended his statement by declaring a renewed commitment to public safety and control. Reporters asked for the detainee's name, and Royce said it was still under investigation. Across the city, however, control had already started slipping. Surveillance drones over government zones began auto-logging anyone who had physically interacted with Kanan Holt within the previous 48 hours. Officer Mills was tagged. So was Beck. So was Sarah. Royce's profile was elevated for internal review. Satellite pings tracked his badge location in real time. Every email, every message, every body cam feed was copied, backed up, and sent to a secure archive labeled J-Level Eyes Only. Meanwhile, at a private monitoring center 3 floors beneath a quiet federal annex, a rotating team of analysts compiled interaction maps of South Georgia law enforcement. She knew what that red dot symbol on the upper corner of the page meant because she had seen it during federal liaison orientation, the mark for field operation assets embedded under executive surveillance directives. The message had been drilled in during training. If you ever see this code in evidence or documents, stop everything and alert the Department of Justice immediately. She had not yet alerted them officially, but the encrypted email earlier had made it clear someone else already had. She just didn't know who. At exactly 8:42 p.m., the fluorescent light above interrogation room flickered to life without anyone turning it on. No one had entered. The room had been empty since the transport mishap earlier that morning, and no new detainees had been brought in. Beck noticed it first on the monitor. She leaned forward, frowned, and tapped the screen to refresh the feed. The camera now showed a figure seated at the metal table. She blinked, leaned back, and then leaned in again. It was him, Kanan Holt. He was seated upright in the same exact posture he had held for the past 2 days, his wrists no longer bound, his expression unreadable. Sarah, hearing Beck's reaction, walked over and froze. The timestamp showed the feed had been live for 6 seconds, but no one had buzzed the door open. No one had seen him enter. The chain of custody was empty. The hallway surveillance still showed darkness. Yet the feed was clear. The man was inside the room. The same notebook sat closed on the table in front of him, dry and unblemished. His watch glowed blue for a moment, then faded. Sarah and Beck stood silently until a voice suddenly crackled over the intercom. The old intercom system no one had used in months due to faulty wiring. The voice was male calm, clipped with authority. Jurisdiction override confirmed. All operations within this building are now under federal review. Do not interfere. Do not engage. Do not leave your station. Royce, who had been half asleep in his office, burst through the hallway, shirt wrinkled, tie hanging loose, demanding to know who had patched into the system. He reached the monitor station and stopped when he saw the image. His face contorted in disbelief, shifting quickly into fury. He stormed down the hallway toward the interrogation room, ignoring Beck shouting behind him. He swiped his badge at the lock panel, but the door didn't open. Instead, 2 men in dark suits stepped into the corridor from the opposite end. Their coats were identical, their movements synchronized, their presence immediate and unquestioned. One of them held up a device the size of a deck of cards, scanned the lock panel, and it opened. Royce tried to step in, but one of the men placed a hand on his chest and said, "Not here, not now." Royce tried to speak again, but the man didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply said, "You will be escorted to the review room." Inside the interrogation chamber, Kanan Holt calmly pulled his left sleeve back, revealing a sleek badge embedded into a magnetic wrist clasp. It folded outward, revealing a gold and black DOJ insignia marked Undercover Oversight Unit, Asset Echo. He placed both hands flat on the table. The camera, now functioning perfectly, caught every second. One of the men placed a sealed evidence bag on the table beside him. Inside were his ID, his phone, and the original copy of the notebook. They had been returned, cleaned, intact. Royce stood frozen in the hallway, jaw clenched. Sarah and Beck were ordered to remain in records. 10 minutes later, Sarah was escorted by one of the men into a private room, where a projector had already been set up. Without saying a word, the man played back every minute of Kanan Holt's initial arrest, the patrol car footage, the squad room commentary, the forced reports, the ignored requests, the erasure of logs, and the public shaming over the internal chat. Sarah covered her mouth. She had seen pieces of it before, but not all at once. Not the coldness. Not the level of calculated humiliation. When the video showed the destruction of the little girl's photo found in Kanan's wallet, she began to cry. The agent paused the video and asked her one question. "Did you ever believe this man posed a threat?" Sarah shook her head. The agent nodded, logged her response, and told her she would be debriefed by a DOJ liaison within the week. Royce, meanwhile, was escorted to a temporary holding area. not in cuffs, but with no access to his weapon or phone. Officer Mills, upon learning about the jurisdiction override, rushed to the terminal and began deleting case notes related to Canaan's file. She thought she had time. She thought the digital audit logs would take days to compile. She was wrong. A second agent entered the server room and caught her mid-deletion. She was asked to step away from the keyboard. When she refused, he powered down the entire system remotely, pulled the drive, and handed her a formal warning notice. Internal obstruction pending disciplinary action. Within minutes, the precinct was locked down. All access cards were temporarily revoked. A mobile command center pulled up outside, staffed with analysts who began cloning body cam footage, station phone records, and the complete digital footprint of every officer who had touched the file. The final page of Canaan Holt's notebook was uploaded into a secure evidence repository by the lead federal agent. It contained a list of names under a single heading: Monitoring Priority 1. Royce Thonner's name was third. Officer Mills was fifth. Files were being scanned, logged, and archived at a pace that overwhelmed the local IT infrastructure. Sarah Keeley stood just outside the records hallway, pale and exhausted from a sleepless night, still trying to absorb the gravity of what she had witnessed, what she had confessed to, and what she had helped reveal. She had testified privately to a DOJ handler late in the evening and been granted immediate protection status for cooperation, though the term itself felt too clean for the moral mess she had watched unfold for 2 straight days. Just after 8 a.m., the first news alerts started appearing on public feeds. National news: DOJ undercover agent profiled, detained illegally in Georgia. The story was already spreading before the first press conference even began. The Department of Justice issued a formal statement within the hour, confirming that Agent Elijah Monroe, known publicly for the first time, had been part of a covert task force assigned to assess racial bias in municipal police departments. It stated that during the course of a routine social behavior observation, Agent Monroe had been unlawfully detained, mishandled, and misidentified by local officers operating without proper oversight. The statement included words like systemic, failure, and accountability. The local paper printed the story in bold black letters with a grainy still image of Elijah taken from the interrogation room camera, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding despite the silence. That image began circulating faster than anyone could control. By noon, it had become a national symbol. Across downtown, in front of the courthouse steps, protesters gathered holding signs that read, "We are watching in silence is not consent." Some carried printouts of Elijah's DOJ badge number. Others carried photos of loved ones whose stories had never gone public. The crowd was quiet, not angry, their voices low but unified. The silence they maintained spoke louder than shouting ever could. Inside the courthouse, Royce Thonner sat in a secure holding room flanked by 2 federal agents. His eyes darted around constantly, unable to settle. He looked older than he had 2 days ago, unshaven, sunken, like the truth had drained something fundamental from his core. Earlier that morning, his home had been raided by internal affairs officers accompanied by federal observers. They had confiscated printed complaints, digital files, and internal communications never disclosed to the review board. Over 30 citizen reports were found hidden in a storage closet behind his desk, all marked unverified, all detailing use of force, racial slurs, coercive silence, and procedural delays. Many had been signed with trembling hands, dated and ignored. Those complaints were now being refiled into open cases. Royce had not spoken since the moment the badge was revealed. Not to the press, not to investigators, not even to his lawyer. Officer Mills had attempted to report for duty that morning, but was immediately approached by 2 agents who handed her a formal document of compelled resignation. Under pressure from internal investigations and mounting evidence of file tampering, she signed without protest. Her locker was emptied. Her badge was surrendered. She left the precinct through the side entrance, head down, escorted by an agent who said nothing the entire walk. Officer Alden had not returned since the night before. His home address was flagged for audit. Officer Beck, who had quietly expressed concerns earlier but failed to act meaningfully, was placed on administrative review. She gave no interviews. Sarah, meanwhile, had been moved to a secure administrative office where she reviewed her testimony 3 times. Each session was recorded and time-stamped. She identified every moment she remembered seeing Elijah Holt, now officially confirmed as Agent Elijah Monroe, being mistreated, ignored, or mocked. She identified every name involved. She cried twice during the second session. Her file was marked as high-priority cooperative witness. In the afternoon, Elijah himself stepped onto a temporary stage built in front of the courthouse. He did not hold a microphone. He did not speak. He simply stood, wearing a plain suit, the same calm posture he had held in every room since the beginning. His badge was displayed on a screen behind him, not blown up to dramatic scale, but rendered in standard proportion. The number was clear. The emblem read United States Department of Justice, Internal Oversight Division. His silence felt ceremonial, as the spoken words would have diminished the weight of the moment. The crowd remained still. Cameras clicked. The broadcast streamed live. He made no statement. And then he stepped down. Back inside the Federal Review Center, his notebook was submitted into digital evidence. Its pages had been scanned, translated, and verified. The contents spanned 5 states for precincts and 3 years of embedded observation. It contained names, badge numbers, timestamps, quotes, and behaviors, all organized into categories: language use, excessive force, report suppression, witness intimidation. Each page told a story. Each annotation was surgical in tone, never emotional. It read more like a surgeon's log than a diary. The last page, already viewed by Sarah the night before, was now officially displayed before the internal tribunal. It held the list of monitored officers, including Royce and Mills, along with behavior assessments logged in real time during their interactions with Monroe. A federal supervisor read aloud the final entry. Subject refused to identify detainee even after being prompted twice. Observed use of public humiliation, physical coercion, verbal degradation, procedural falsification. Detainee maintained silence. Response confirmed. Mission complete. The silence that had once choked the interrogation room now hovered over the entire department. Officers avoided eye contact. Desks that had once buzzed with casual conversation now sat still, keyboards untouched. But this time, the system didn't tilt. It cracked. And in the weeks following the confirmation of Agent Elijah Monroe's identity and the release of the footage detailing every moment of his mistreatment, the consequences arrived with force and finality. Royce Thonner was formally charged in federal court with unlawful detention, obstruction of justice, falsifying official records, and abuse of power under color of law. The indictment was read aloud by a U.S. attorney in a courtroom filled with quiet civilians and stiff-jawed officers. Cameras were barred from the hearing, but the transcript was released within hours, and its language was sharp and unyielding. Royce, in a crumpled suit and state-issue tie, said nothing as the charges were listed. His attorney asked for leniency on the basis of public service history, but the judge reminded the court that power without accountability was the root of corruption. Royce's pension was immediately frozen. His access to government networks revoked. His badge decommissioned and cataloged into the Federal Misconduct Archive. The same day, over a dozen civilians who had filed complaints against him over the past decade came forward again, emboldened by Elijah's silent testimony and the undeniable evidence it produced. They described similar patterns: arrests without cause, intimidation during questioning, belittling remarks, coerced signatures on blank forms, destroyed evidence. One woman brought a stained shirt her brother had worn when Royce slammed him to the ground in 2014. Another produced an audio recording from a body Mike she'd secretly worn during a traffic stop. The stories rippled outward, prompting civil rights attorneys to launch a coordinated legal response. Within a week, 7 lawsuits were filed. Within a month, 20. Officer Orla Mills, who had attempted to erase Elijah's records and laughed openly about his silence, was barred from public service by executive order. Her certifications were revoked. Her case files were sent to DOJ auditors. She was found to have misfiled 23 civilian complaints in the past 5 years and had altered 3 digital timestamps to minimize response time violations. She was escorted from her home during a morning raid, not in cuffs, but surrounded by silent observers who cataloged every item she tried to carry. She left behind a badge, a department-issued laptop, and a broken reputation. Internal audits uncovered an entire network of falsified reports, with nearly 1 in 5 use of force forms showing identical language, templated excuses, and missing timestamps. The precinct's chief, who had claimed to have no knowledge of misconduct, was removed after agents discovered a hidden email thread marked private, in which he described Elijah as a potential agitator and suggested letting him cool off in holding for a day. That message alone was enough to trigger immediate dismissal. In the days that followed, the precinct building itself became a symbol of everything the community had grown to distrust. Someone spray-painted "Remember Monroe" across the front wall in bold, steady strokes. It wasn't colorful. It wasn't artistic. It was black paint on brick, plain, blunt, unmistakable. And no one cleaned it. When city maintenance workers arrived 2 days later to remove it, they were stopped by a peaceful crowd holding signs. They stood in front of the wall until the workers packed up and left. The graffiti remained. Inside City Hall, community leaders were brought in to lead a reform committee. They were given full access to internal policy, training protocols, hiring practices, and discipline files. They were allowed to question officers directly, to attend staff meetings, and to submit reforms for immediate vote. And when they did, the reforms passed without resistance. No one wanted to defend what had been exposed. Elijah Monroe, now reassigned to another DOJ division, declined all media requests. He was never quoted. He never gave a written statement. He never went on record. But his presence lingered. His notebook, now displayed in a federal training center, was scanned into DOJ archives and used as a training document across multiple states. Every page was preserved, every word studied. Sarah Keeley, having testified under oath and submitted her resignation voluntarily, joined a civil advocacy group that trained community leaders to recognize systemic failure in policing. She gave a single interview, published anonymously, in which she said that sometimes silence isn't a lack of courage, it's a method of survival and a mirror. She now leads workshops in high schools and community centers. Across the state, protests led to the governor issuing a formal apology on live television, standing behind a podium draped in both the American flag and the state seal. He called Elijah Monroe's treatment shameful and pledged funding for independent citizen oversight committees. The same day, the city council voted to remove a bronze statue that had stood outside City Hall for 50 years, a tribute to a former police commissioner known for his tough-on-crime policies. The statue was pulled down at sunrise. No speeches were given, just the sound of bolts being turned and metal scraping against stone. In the months that followed, the town's tourism dropped by nearly a quarter. Business owners reported fewer out-of-state visitors. Conference centers canceled bookings. High schools received requests to postpone law enforcement recruitment visits. Every officer who had laughed, mocked, or remained silent during Elijah's detainment was flagged for ethics review. A new internal division was created to monitor speech in patrol car recordings. Transparency protocols were updated. Ethics reports doubled. Officer Beck was moved to a civilian role. Officer Kersey, who had posted Elijah's photo in a group chat, was fired and added to the misconduct registry. Royce's family began to feel the weight of public backlash. His son, a third-year law student at Emory University, filed legal paperwork to change his last name, citing safety concerns and emotional harm. The court granted the request. Royce now lived in a borrowed trailer 3 counties away, under limited movement guidelines while awaiting trial. He reported weekly to a probation officer. And, in one final development, the same satellite system that had originally tracked Agent Monroe's silence was now repurposed to track Royce Thonner's public appearances, movement patterns, and communication footprint under federal probation protocol. A box in his living room blinked silently every 6 hours, transmitting data to an oversight center. The road to reconciliation is not paved with apologies, not lined with handshakes or speeches or gestures designed to appease an audience. It begins in silence, not the cold, dismissive silence that once filled the back seat of a patrol car, but the kind that comes when there are no more lies left to protect, when a man has nothing more to prove and no one left to convince. Years had passed since the trial, since the courtrooms fell quiet and the headlines moved on. Royce Thonner, now well into his 60s, lived alone in a cabin surrounded by pine trees and mud roads 2 counties away from the city that once made him feel untouchable. He had not worn a badge in years, not spoken to a former colleague in months, and not used his full name in public since the first day of his probation hearing. The trailer had been sold. The tracking device had long since been removed. But the silence never left. It followed him like a fog, seeping into every conversation, every errand, every attempt to move forward. People did not forget. They simply chose how loudly they remembered. He lived off a modest savings account, supplemented by occasional seasonal work at a logging supply shop where no one asked questions, as long as he showed up on time and didn't bring the past with him. The clerk at the gas station recognized his face but never said his name. The woman at the post office handed him his mail without comment. They were polite but not kind, distant but not cruel. Royce came to understand that in a place where everyone had seen the same news broadcast, the same body cam footage, the same moment when a man in silence exposed everything, he was never going to be forgotten. He didn't deserve to be. One crisp autumn morning, as yellow leaves swept across the dirt road leading up to his porch, Royce opened his mailbox and found a single envelope with no return address. Inside was a glossy photo printed on thick cardstock. The image showed the building that used to be the precinct, now completely renovated. Its brick exterior painted a soft gray, with steel letters across the entrance that read Elijah Monroe Justice Center. Below the photo was a handwritten note in blue ink that simply read, "We cannot undo the harm, but we can stop repeating it." Royce sat on the porch steps with the photo in hand for nearly half an hour, saying nothing, the wind tugging lightly at the corners of the paper. That afternoon, he cleaned up the front seat of his rusting pickup, drove into the city for the first time in nearly 2 years, and parked 3 blocks away from Orchard Park. He walked the rest of the way, hands in his coat pockets, head down, nodding at the few strangers who passed without recognizing him. The bench where it had all started was still there. The tree above it had grown, its roots now pushing slightly at the concrete beneath the sidewalk. The vending machine was gone. A new playground had been installed across the path. Royce stood in front of the bench for a long time, then slowly sat down, resting his palms on his knees the way Canaan, no Elijah, had done years ago. For the first time in a long time, he understood the weight of stillness. He stayed there until the shadows stretched long across the ground and a few children chased each other through fallen leaves. No one spoke to him. No one needed to. Back in town, Mills had re-emerged, not as an officer, but as a volunteer mentor at a youth conflict resolution center funded by the DOJ's post-settlement grant. Her public service ban had remained, but the agency overseeing reform had agreed to let her contribute through education. She now worked with teenagers who had grown up in neighborhoods over-policed and underheard, helping them learn how to navigate confrontations, how to stand their ground with dignity, and how to express rage without losing themselves in it. She never spoke about her time as an officer. She never defended it. But when asked why she chose this path, she simply said, "I had to do something better with the rest of what I have." Sarah had become a lead trainer in racial bias prevention at the state's Cadet Academy. Her curriculum included video analysis, simulation drills, and readings from real DOJ reports. One day each semester, she read aloud the full timeline of Elijah Monroe's detainment, from the moment he was told to leave a bench without cause, to the moment his name appeared on the side of a federal training document. The cadets listened. Some took notes. Others just sat, wide-eyed, realizing for the first time how fragile the boundary was between perceived authority and actual justice. Elijah Monroe himself never returned to the city. After his reassignment, he continued field work in another region, eventually moving into internal policy design. His name became more than a name, it became a standard. His notebook was printed into training packets. His methods were adopted by oversight boards. His silence, once mocked, was now taught as discipline, as control, as the kind of presence that dismantles ego without raising a voice. Each time a new recruit asked what happened to him, instructors simply said, "He did his job, better than anyone else." In the years that followed, other cities began adopting similar reform models. Some faced resistance, others moved faster than expected. But the memory of that single arrest, of a black man with a notebook being dragged from a bench for no other reason than sitting silently, remained in the national conversation. It became a case study, a documentary, a moment of reckoning. The statue outside City Hall was replaced with a simple stone circle bearing the names of those wrongly detained across the state in the previous decade. At its center stood a brass plate inscribed with the words, "Dignity begins where assumption ends." Royce continued to live in his cabin. He never remarried. His son never changed his name back. But on certain Sundays, he drove into town not to speak or explain, but to sit on the same bench and watch the park fill with laughter, conversation, stillness. Some afternoons, someone would join him, a student, a volunteer, a stranger. And if they asked who he was, he'd say, "Just someone who used to see things wrong." In his final years, Royce was invited to speak at community forums about law enforcement reform. He never used notes. He never defended himself. He simply told the story of a man who said nothing, who refused to argue, who stayed silent while everyone else tried to dominate the noise, and who somehow said everything that needed to be said without speaking at all. The silence was no longer shameful. It was no longer a tool of suppression. It had become a mirror held up to an entire system, reflecting what too many had refused to see. And in that mirror, even those who once wielded power without consequence could finally recognize themselves. Not to be redeemed, not to be applauded, but to be changed. The end. If this story left you thinking, if it stirred something in you, whether it was anger, sadness, or clarity, don't leave without showing support. Like the video if you believe stories like Elijah Monroe's need to be told louder. Subscribe if you want more true-to-life narratives that hold a mirror to power and remind us that silence is not surrender, it's a signal. And tell us in the comments, what part of the story stayed with you the most? Was it Royce sitting on that bench years later, or Sarah reading the timeline aloud to new cadets? Let us know where you're watching from and how this story made you feel. Your voice matters, and stories like this only live on when they're shared.